Good afternoon. Hello, everyone here, and also those of you joining us live at this live. I'm Nora Winkler. I'm going to host this event, which is about the future of MoMA, Hungary's most important institution in the creative field. Or to have a shorter statement, this event is to speak about what MoMA will be, plans to be, aims to be by 2030, and of course, way ahead beyond this date. Let me introduce the speakers of this panel. Some of them are here with me right on the stage. One of them is joining us live from New York. So those of you who are here, on the furthest from me, Gergely Böszörményi Nagy, President of the MoMA Foundation, Albert László Barabási, network scientist, both based in Budapest and Boston. And the third of us is András Szántó, joining us live from New York, a cultural consultant. Hi. Nice to see you. So MoMA is going through a very ambitious renewal these years. Some of it can be seen from the outside if we think about this amazing, fantastic looking campus. And there's also a new operating model and renewal in terms of what MoMA as a university offers to its students. And this whole renewal is driven by MoMA Foundation, which started the job by crafting a very ambitious and big research in order to understand the current position of the university, the strengths and weaknesses it's facing, and also to understand what globally MoMA looks like and feels like and what it's understood as a university. The next 45 minutes, because that's what we have for the panel, and then there's 50-minute Q&A. So the first 45 minutes aims to open up about the results of this research, to speak about the first steps that were taken, understanding the results, and also plans for the longer future. So first I turn to you, Gergő, and I ask you, what is this project and why are you doing this?
Good evening, everyone. So when I got this commission to help the university from the Prime Minister, his brief was very short and very simple. Let's make MoMA an international brand. It was pretty much a very brief, I would say, but very logical. Why MoMA? Why MoMA is the institution among all those universities in the region in Hungary, which is the most fit for being international. I think there is a million reasons, and one of them is definitely the nature of it. So design and art are international languages. Without those barriers, we know very well when it comes to the spoken language, our beautiful language, the Hungarian language, which is very interesting, but very hard, and very unique and pretty much isolated. So it gives us a barrier to connect with the world many times. Design and art can help us to connect to others around. The second reason is competition. So there is a deadly competition in higher education, even if we don't face it. A competition between universities, so we compete with schools in a regional and European scale and global scale, actually, in the design field and the art field as well. And of course, the students themselves are competing with each other in the creative industries. Even the most talented are under massive pressure of competition. So being competitive is essential. Last but not least, the name of the university brings some certain responsibility. And László Moholi Nagy was a Hungarian genius, but also some natural-born international designer and artist, and someone who always looked by aspiration, by ambition, to have an impact on civilization abroad as well, not only at home. And I think this gives us the responsibility to be authentic to his name. A university under his name should be internationally recognized. So that was just 3 of the most important reasons why MOME should aim to be a household name out of our borders as well. And how to start it? If you want to do it, not only by intuition, but also the humble way, then you have to take a look at the numbers. You have to face reality. There's a brilliant mathematician called Edward Deming who famously said that without data, what you have is only an opinion. So that was the point when an old friend's name, Laci's name, came to my mind, because several reasons. First of all, because I knew that he and his team are just brilliant when it comes to data science, and not only collecting data, but also structuring and understanding what data tells us. Second reason is that I knew back then already that he just loves art and design. He's active in this field, he's authentic to this field, and interested in this field. And not least, he even worked together with MOME students in past projects. So I just thought that it's basically a match made in heaven.
And you share this. You also think you are part of this match made in heaven.
Well, it was a request indeed that did fit to some degree our profile, but it also had its own challenges. So, I mean, let me just bring it closer to where we are in that space. Obviously, I'm known as a network scientist, but in the last 10 years, my lab has been focused on what we call science of science. And it's actually a name we coined many years ago, and now it's a discipline of its own. And the science of science is an attempt to use data to really understand how science evolves. What is the role of the institutions? What is the role of the journals? How does the system work? And eventually, of course, we do so that we understand what can you do as an individual, be that a scientist, be as a science administrator, a university president, to really further science. And this has been really a major topic of research in the last decade in my lab. One product of that has been Beyond the Research Papers, a book that they published about 2 years ago called Science of Science, that tries to summarize some of the principles that kind of how we can use data to understand the scientific enterprise. Now, MOME was a particular challenge because MOME its work is rooted in science, but its fundamental output is not in science. So it's a hybrid institution, right? Hybrid in a good sense, in the sense that it has another mission that is closer to art than to science, and closer to design. But there comes actually my other identity that not only I'm interested very much in art, but my lab's practice is to look at the art from the data perspective. And this is something that I believe that there is a need for it because we live in the 21st century and just about anything that comes towards us is decided by data. Even the fact of what kind of ball I will get actually here next to me at this conversation was decided by somebody's data of what is the right type of water that should be available in the market and so on and so forth. So 21st century is very data driven, and it's not at all surprising that if we want to look at the institution, we should start with the data. But of course, data alone is not enough. You also have to put your soul there and experience. So we are the data, everybody else is going to have to put their soul into that.
But the idea that you use data when it's a university that's about creativity, that's so soft and hard to totally define and catch, like the idea that you use data for to help an institution like that is not new right now. It's not shocking now.
Not at all. Actually, many kind of organizations, including Nature magazine itself, has an arm that offers these type of services to universities. And I should actually emphasize that every university's goal is creativity, and MoMA is no different from Harvard or from any other university. But I hear you that the outputs are different. So let's distinguish the process of creativity and from the product of that creativity. And while data may not be able to capture what happens in your mind and the creative process, certainly data can process the products of creativity if there is such. So when we actually use data and we use science of science to look at the universities, to look at scientists and so on, the goal is to capture the product and the impact of that product. And this is exactly what my team has done in this case as well, is to use data science to collect all the data that is available, not only about MoMA, but also many other art and design institutions that work in the same space, and compare them. Because I often say a number by itself is meaningless. A number only matters when we compare it to other numbers and sets a scale. So doing a study on MoMA is not useful unless we actually can say how others are doing. So the point of this exercise was to look at multi-dimensional data, from publications to grants to visibility in social media to visibility in the news across multiple dimensions, and to see where does MoMA stand compared to its peer institutions being defined as institutions, other institutions in Eastern Europe and in Hungary, but most important, institutions that MoMA may aspire to, which is very successful design-oriented institutions around the world.
Did you want to add something? Then now I'd like to invite our third panelist waiting to enter us, András Szánto. Hi, András. I did introduce him partly, but I'd like to say that now he's in New York, where he lives. He was born in Budapest, but spent the last 30 years working in New York. But he has spent quite a sum of time right here in this building in the last couple of months, working closely with MoMA people. And he's an author and consultant who has helped to develop cultural strategies for various institutions like Metropolitan Museum of Art, Stanford University, BMW, just to name a few. So András, when you joined this team, there were 25 people working closely. What was your role in the process with them? How did you work together, and on what did you work together?
First of all, it's really nice to be here in this unusual way, and hello to everyone. I would say my involvement is in fact a demonstration of networks at work. Laszlo and I have been collaborating on some of the projects relating to the things he was just discussing around networks and art and so forth. So it was only natural that our conversations led to an introduction to the university. We can later get into some of the sentimental reasons and attachments I have to this university. And I was immediately intrigued by the idea that MoMA was undertaking data science-based analysis. And of course, data, Laszlo has just said, the number is only, is only meaningful in relation to another number. I think the larger way of saying that is that data needs to be interpreted. Data without interpretation is fairly meaningless. And I think that is perhaps was the initial way that I was able to connect into this project, that is to say, working with the data science team, not necessarily to extract or analyze the data, but to make sense of it, to sort of try to understand what conclusions there are to be drawn, what guidance obtains from this data, what is it that we're really learning from this data. And what predisposed me to this role is that unlike Laszlo, I actually spent all of my professional time in the loosely defined art world, cultural world, to some extent educational world, because for now a very long time I've been working on strategy development for museums, foundations, cultural institutions, educational institutions. Nonetheless, I really have to stress that this way of thinking, while necessary, is really quite new. You know, in our sector, in the cultural sector, we tend to rarely use data, partly because we don't have access to it, partly because it's not the language we speak, and for very complicated reasons. So my initial role was to be part of the data piece, but that sort of pivoted naturally to the other side because, as it has already been said, cultural institutions in particular are not just reducible to, you know, the sort of tough categorical facts of numbers. They have a highly qualitative side. So in parallel and really building on the quantitative analysis over the most of last summer, most of this year really, we began an additional linked research process that was built on a lot of qualitative inputs. So that included listening to people inside the university, wide range of faculty, people outside the university, you know, art and design university experts, people who lead these kinds of institutions. We talked and had really in-depth interviews with very important experts in the field, like Paolo Antonelli, not at MoMA, but at MoMA in New York, the fantastic design curator there. We were interested to see what are the perceptions of this university. And we also analyzed how art and design universities communicate their values, their missions, their visions, to position themselves on that, you know, as was remarked, this competitive international landscape of institutions. And then through a series of workshops, we have been crystallizing and distilling a series of statements that build on the institution's previous identity, using all these inputs to formulate its mission, its vision, and its core guiding values. And this has been a wonderfully interesting iterative process, working together with quite a large group of faculty. And although the results haven't been published yet, I think they help position the university on this landscape and help it to move forward as it sort of refocuses its energies.
Was there something really unusual for you coming out from the data part of this research? Was there something you would never have thought looks like this, is like this?
So I think this is the moment of truth. I have to say that when it comes to MoMA itself, there were no real surprises for me as a semi-outsider coming just in the last year to the university. But we needed the data to have the basis of a dynamical change. We needed the data, we needed the research, we needed the facts in order to build a consensus on the nature of the change we are seeking, and also to build a coalition in the institution to realize the ambitions. So those results are relatively low visibility when it comes to international level, was not new. Those results, when it comes to the low results in funding, external funding, and the grants, was not a surprise. And the low level of network embeddedness, I would say, in international networks was hardly a surprise. We knew this. We just had to have the data in order to push the change. But at the other side, we did find a lot of surprising results when it comes to the international market space of art and design universities. from the Baltics to the Netherlands. One of the most surprising results was the strength and significance of local partnerships around these art and design universities. So when we think about success, we tend to think about very international things, and this is fine. The most successful universities are also very strong in local partnerships, and by local I mean citywide partnerships, regional partnerships, national partnerships with research hubs, other universities, corporations, small middle-sized entrepreneurs, locality and the local ecosystem, how the university are embedded to the local creative and innovation ecosystem is very, very important. One of the strongest ecosystems is the Estonian, and Estonia is famous because of its IT and startup ecosystem. They are also very strong, it turned out. They are also very, very strong when it comes to art and design. And basically it's because they put a strong emphasis on local and regional networking. So that was a good message for us, because there is a lot of potential in the region.
What Gergő started with, naming the not surprising surprises, was the visibility. What kind of data do you collect when you want to see a visibility of an institution like MoMA?
Well, always the data that you collect is tailored towards the goal ahead and the particular problem you're trying to address. So we did collect, of course, the traditional publication metrics. How many papers were they published? What was their impact, and so on. But this is actually where you start with the normal university, which, like, let's put it not normal, but the research university. In MoMA's case, of course, that was not the most relevant factor. So the data included, as we talked about, grants. It did include actually visibility in the kind of press analysis where the projects are being mentioned. It did include social media presence and so on. And there were actually, for me, like kind of not being kind of embedded in institution, there were a couple of surprises, because it did show what are the areas where MoMA has visibility. And that included, for example, the textile, so the textile program over here. It also included its links to the automotive industry, which apparently has kind of a long history within. And these really matter, because if you understand what are the aspects of the institution that are already being appreciated and seen by the world, then actually that can offer us a backbone of strength on which you can build. You also know what are the missing pieces in the story, and what are the other institutions doing to kind of be more harmonious and more widely kind of balanced, and you know where you actually have to push for. We also saw, for example, in the publication space, it was interesting to see that, yes, MoMA faculty have publications, and they're actually kind of in line with the Eastern European landscape. So when we compare to other Eastern European institutions of similar nature, that's kind of the same numbers that we get. But Eastern Europe as a group is about one order of magnitude under the similar Western European institutions, which indicates that the Western European institutions do invest or do much more in the research piece and the publication following the research piece, and they consider that as an important criteria. One of the things, of course, is that every institution should have its own metrics, so may not matter that to be the strength, but if you want to benchmark your institutions, there is an order of magnitude gap that needs to be filled in, which is possible once you know that that gap is over there.
András, when you heard about the findings of this research, how did you start working with them? So in your team, how did you reflect on what came out from the hard facts, from the data part?
Well, I think we took that as the foundation to build on, and to sort of build a narrative on. I mean, as Gergő has also indicated, some of the data science here is not so much about capturing a sense of identity or values or mission. it is also about recording, establishing a baseline for growth. And, cultural institutions are not particularly good at that. They are rarely holding themselves accountable to very specific measures or indicators of achievement. Clearly, in a university, a lot of that is tied in with publications and membership in networks and ability to graduate students who in turn are visible in those international networks. So once you have those numbers, you can begin to implement some strategies around how you grow, how you improve your achievement. But I think a lot of the work that we did was really complementary to that in ways that I've indicated, which is that you would never want to just reduce a cultural institution to a set of what we call KPIs. There's more to it than that. I want to say though that a big part of all this is how do you even capture a moment in the life of an institution? How do you capture expectations in a world that is changing so rapidly? I'm just reflecting on this now because a few moments ago, literally a few moments ago, somebody sent me the first video of the first electric Rolls-Royce, which, among other things, has to be completely redesigned visually also to reflect that there's now an electric Rolls-Royce. At the same time, yesterday, I was at the Shed, a fantastic space designed by De Laurentiis-Scofidio in New York, where I saw an artistic performance that a generation ago nobody would have recognized as art. It consisted of very large, what seemed to be pieces of concrete that were hovering above the audience. It turned out to be drones that were kind of moving around in the space. In any event, I guess what I'm trying to say is that as we try to frame a purpose for a cultural institution, an art and design school, yes, we can rely on hard data, but we also have to recognize that we are operating in an environment of accelerating change. And how you navigate that change is not just based on data, it's also based on what values you tie yourself to. I mean, to name one, sustainability. Clearly one of the leading value factors today in the design space, or cooperation, collaboration, the need to work together rather than in separate silos, because the complex problems of today and tomorrow demand a kind of deep collaboration, exactly the kind of collaboration that sometimes universities as institutions make quite difficult. So I think in the work that we built on top of the data science, we were trying to also get deep inside some of these values-based priorities that sort of frame the space in which the institution is trying to navigate in the years to come.
What Andras is saying is very interesting, what he said about accountability and how institutions like this, coming from the field of culture and creativity, where there are these soft values, numbers and hard facts are a little bit alien. Yet, as he says, they should be part of the picture. How do you see MoMA in the future? What will be your way of measuring the success of this institution?
Yeah, so coming back to what Andras said, is it's very important that these two types of information, identity and feelings and data, are not necessarily contradictory towards each other. These are just two forms of the same reality. And I think it's very important, and one of the most important ambitions of our team at MoMA is to synchronize the brand, the image which is around us from an outdoor perspective, and the identity that we have in the inside. So these two things should be synchronized. The more synchronized, the better. And of course, there are oceans of market opportunities we didn't even try to go after in the last decades because of many very profound reasons, because of financial reasons, because of limited ambitions, etc. But now this is the time to go after it. And we have to go after it with synchronized aspirations and based on a continuous attempt to face the reality. So we have to measure ourselves. We have to accept that this is a hybrid institution. Not everything can be measured by numbers, but numbers are there and they can support our thinking and our strategy. And we started it 1 year ago. This is just a raw list of developments at the university. So first of all, we hired some people with significant international network, because network embeddedness was definitely one of the weaknesses we realized by the research. So we hired Margaret Dowling, a very professional brand spin doctor, I would say, to head the brand office of MOME. We hired Lasmai Vaska from Riga to lead the innovation operation, and there are many new positions opening up in the next couple of months. We launched the grant office, so an office which is responsible for EU partnerships, for international partnerships, constantly seeking for new opportunities. We entirely redesigned the IP system, the intellectual property system. Now the faculty members, also the students, are directly interested in developing new IP together with the university. This was very important when it comes to scientific and art and design output, I would say. Of course, we also started to craft our first English language programs, because it's very hard to imagine an international brand without English language education. So we started that, and from next fall, we will have, according to our expectations, we will have 2 new fully English master programs each academic year. Not least, what András also mentioned, that we started to craft the branding of MOME, the brand book, the brand mission, the brand value set for an internationally understandable university. Mm-hmm. That was also important. And just one little addition, Lotzi and his team told us at the end of the research that, well, these were interesting results, but we have to remeasure them from time to time. Maybe every quarter we have to remeasure them in order to see the trend lines, right? And so we hired the first data scientist of MOME. So now we have our own data scientist who can remeasure, look after the numbers, and support us with the metrics.
Do you think this remeasurement is also becoming more important, because when we aim to understand the future, right now it's becoming more and more complex, as it's a very fast changing thing what we think about future, and an institution like this has to understand future well, because it sends out students to solve problems the future constantly brings. So did it become harder to put down statements?
Well, it's not harder, but I think it's not only about remeasurement, but also coming up with other dimensions. Let me actually kind of give a perspective. So one way to think about what happened until now is what happens when you go to the doctor for a first time with a new disease or potential symptoms, right? And it starts with the lab. It starts with blood, it starts with x-rays, and that's what people like me do, right? So we are the lab, we measure things and we provide input, we provide numbers. But it's not the lab technician who decides neither the diagnosis nor what the treatment will be. So we provided the numbers, we provided the parameters, and now it's up to the leadership of the university to really see, first provide the diagnosis, and then to provide the treatment for the future. But with any treatment, it has to be monitored, right? Have we actually succeeded with our goals? And I think this is where the remeasurement goes in. And when you have a situation like that, even in a medical situation, and I'm sorry for bringing the medical example, you know, part of my job is at Harvard Medical School, where I see lots of doctors as my colleagues. And when it comes to remeasurement, once you have a diagnosis, you're not going to start measuring over and over everything. You're focusing only on the problems of interest for you. So what I mean by that in the context, the goal is not necessary to do another full analysis of the MoMA every quarter or every year, but rather to pick the metrics that really the leadership decides is vital to the future, and then to monitor whether those metrics have been met or not. And as the goal kind of develops, to develop new metrics that really captures better the interplay between the different factors. So one way to set the future is to have a mission statement, but the other one is behind the mission statement to have the particular metrics that allows everyone to independently, as well as the leadership, to monitor how close are we to this mission statement.
Can I add to that,
Yeah.
if you can hear me?
Go on, Rash.
Yes. Well, I think that's a great analogy about the labs and the doctors. I think where perhaps in the cultural sector we're a little different is that, you know, if there's a diagnosis of low blood pressure or indications of, I don't know, cancer, there is a very clear sense of what is the desired state, you know, to be free of the disease, to resolve the problem that is being diagnosed. In the case of a cultural institution, the question of what is the desired state is not so obvious necessarily. And I'll just give you one example. So when you have a Central European art and design school, you may be tempted to move in one of several directions. One could be to say, look, we happen to be in Budapest, but we want to be exactly like any other of the top 5 or top 10 universities. We really don't want to be any different. We want to emulate, we want to compete on that level. Another point of view might be that you want to, you know, while you know, connect to international standards and protocols and professionalism, and you speak English and you do all those things, nonetheless, you want to embrace your regionality, your cultural specificity. And that is entirely a matter of choice, ultimately. It's not necessarily the data that will tell you that. And those were the kind of questions we grappled with subsequently. The good news is that once you make that choice, you can then look for data that could help tell you whether you are doing what you said you would do. And I just want to also go back to confirm that absolutely everything we're speaking about here is data, right? Whether it's a distribution on a pie chart about which social media you find MoMA graduates in, or whether it's pages and pages of text coming out of an interview. This is all data, and we all have to make sense of this data. And probably if we had this conversation 30 years from now, more and more of the sense making and analysis would itself be done with the help of machines. You wouldn't need a guy like me necessarily. And one last point. Laszlo has talked about the science of science. And I think that's a wonderful term, immediately understandable term. Which of course begs the question, can there be a science of art? You know, can we use scientific tools, data analysis, algorithms to answer questions that are, that belong in the domain of art and creativity, this sort of soft, mushy world of art and creativity? And I think one of the very interesting things that is happening, Laszlo and I have many conversations about this, is that we are in fact moving into a world where the computing power, the availability of massive data sets, the incredible sophistication, partly coming out of the kind of work Laszlo has been doing, is beginning to get us to a world where we can actually talk about big complex issues relative to art and design in the language of science. That's not to say that we should get rid of a beautiful tradition of humanistic debate and thought, but we are living in a moment where a kind of scientific, quantitative, analytical turn is going to give us new tools to think in new ways and to communicate in new ways about art and culture.
So Kissinger said that the first step to solve difficult and complex problems to reduce them to simple problems. And let's just summarize most of the aspects of the research in one term. So what turned out, and that was once again hardly a surprise, but it's very important, what makes a great school is the great student experience. So I think if we want to build the best school in the region and one of the best schools in Europe, then we have to have the best student experience in our field. And everything what we do, everything, from the grants to branding, from the canteen to the sports activities, of course, the teaching and the content of teaching and the methodology of teaching should aim to build the best student experience in the art and design field, the best in the region, for sure, and one of the best in Europe. And why not the best in Europe? So this was the essential result, and everything else are mostly technical details, how to build it, how to achieve this.
It's nice that you came in to add this, because this is exactly what I wanted to ask from you. So now I will ask something else. That in this process, which is a long-term thing, and it's an ongoing thing, and it will involve all three of you for quite a while, I suppose. Having all this data, having all these softer inputs, understanding what this institution was and is and wants to be, how does the guy, after him this institution is named, come into the picture for you personally? So while you do this project, how often you think of, so we are building an institution named after Moholy Nagy, what his legacy is, what his input was into the world of not only design, but teaching and thinking. So how does he come into the picture to you personally? It's my final question to all three of you.
So Laszlo started by saying that MoMA is a hybrid institution. We rarely use this term, but it is, and this is a good term. I think one of the message we got from the research, not to be shy because of this hybridness. So Laszlo Moholy Nagy was a great humanist. Also, he worked for the British Navy. He was an unbelievably complex guy with a very complex impact. And I think MoMA, which made itself by mining these different fields into one portfolio, should be proud of it and should even strengthen this complexity of its professional portfolio. There is nothing wrong with being complex if it's understandable for the outer world. That is the authenticity to his legacy. And I'm really proud that Laszlo introduced us with András, because it was him, and thanks so much for that. Because András knows very, very much about Laszlo Moholy Nagy, and he gives us even more insight how to be authentic to this story.
András, what would you add? What's your personal idea of Moholy Nagy during this work?
Well, I think what I would say, first of all, is that Gergo just described a very important aspect of what makes a great school, and talked about the student experience. But I think a really critical term in that context is ethos. What is the set of values that informs, that envelops, that brings together that experience from an intellectual level? And I think in this respect, MoMA is exceptionally lucky because it carries the name of a creative individual who has a connection to Hungary, although he was rather young when he left, but who, in many ways, even though he's long ago passed, represents, I think, a kind of ethos, a kind of relationship to creativity that is absolutely of the moment. The idea that creativity is there to make a better world. The connections to Bauhaus with its interest in practical, applicable solutions that actually improve people's lives, not just a kind of belly button gazing aestheticism. The idea of adaptability, that as a creative person over the course of your career, you may be making camouflage for the army, and maybe you'll make, I don't know, dinnerware as well for another company. The idea of sort of forging your own path, of being an entrepreneur as well as a creative person, and above all, the idea of interdisciplinarity. I don't think that any artist embodies more than Moholy the idea that you can move between painting, sculpture, photography, applied art, design, new technologies. He would have a field day with the situation we're in. So in this respect, MoMA is extraordinarily lucky because Moholy is not only represents a kind of 21st century ideas about creativity, much more, frankly, than other great artists of the 20th century. But he's also linked to Hungary. So if the university was named after Kossuth Lajos, for example, it would be a different story. If it was named after Mies van der Rohe, it would be a different story. But there's a great congruence between the educational mission of a 21st century art and design university and Moholy's ethos, which is why all the interviews we did, all the feedback we got, both internally and externally, stress that we should put Moholy really at the center of the story, not as a way of worshiping a dead artist or designer, but because we are so exceptionally lucky to have this icon inform the ethos of MoMA.
László, anything personal you'd like to add to?
Well, I mean, I think András is kind of also not mentioning the fact that he had a personal connection to the Moholy family, and he has a very, very deep understanding, and is also on the board of the foundation of the Moholy Knights. So he really brings a personal perspective. And I personally think that the Moholy Knight name also demands kind of that quality from the university, which raises the question, is such a change that we envision here possible? Are there precedents actually for that in higher education? And I'm glad to say that there are, and I have had a chance to firsthand experience that. So when I was a graduate student at the early 90s in Boston, there was a university that we would never dare to go except in groups. It was in the most dangerous part of Boston, and it was a commuting school that happened to have a strong physics department, but really the university was defined by a giant parking lot where students would drive in for evening classes. 20 years later, when I returned to Boston, first to Harvard Medical School, I was surprised to actually get an invitation whether I would want to join the faculty of that university. And my first instinct was, why would I ever want to do that? And then I was actually very surprised to discover the change that university has undergone. Turned out, mid-90s, the university effectively went bankrupt the way the changes had happened. And it decided to come out of this bankruptcy by turning into elite university. Now we're talking about a university that was unranked, which means ranked under 1,000, with the aspirations to become an elite top 100 university in the United States. And they did it. Today is actually ranked number 40 in the US ranking list, which is a very, very elite position. There's no other example of a university anywhere making that change. And they did so using numbers. What the university leadership has decided is that since we have to redo the university from bottom up, we might as well do the change in a way to really reflect where we want to be. And effectively, they looked at everything. What requires student experience means small classes. They reduced the class size under what you actually consider small classes. The student experience in the case of US meant that you cannot be a local university, you have to be a global. So they built dormitories to bring international students and to bring national from all over the US. And when I ended up joining university, it was ranked 99. Today, as I said, it's ranked 40. And it's
because of you, of course.
Exactly.
Because of you.
I also like to think that.
I'm happy to try to take credit, but that's actually much bigger than any of us in this story. And the way I kind of characterize to people when they try to come to Northeastern, what is special about the space is that everybody believes that there's only one way to go before the university, which is further up. Mm-hmm. And so I have seen in action personally how can a no-name, unknown university actually turn into one of the elite universities. And the most important part is to believe that I can do that. And to have actually the structural backbone to do that. And then third is to doggedly follow the data.
Thank you to all three of you in this panel, and I'd like to open the floor to the questions. We have a little bit more than 10 minutes for that, so those of you who raise hands will get mics.
Thank you very much for the invitation to this panel and for sharing fascinating first insights into your research. I'm Martin Kern from the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, which is also based here in Budapest. So the content of your research and also the development of this strategy resonates, of course, very well with us, because we have built over the last 10 years Europe's largest innovation community with over 2,000 partners, which exactly are built on the idea, which was central to what you discussed, of having networks that by cooperating will accelerate progress towards creativity being turned into concrete solutions. So that is the focus also of my comment, and also maybe question to the panel. So for me, two things are especially fascinating. What you said, that it's creativity on the one hand can also be measured, and you have KPIs for that, and that's also how we approach innovation. So to some degree you can plan it, you can have top-down cooperations to solve certain challenges. In our case, it is always focused on the big societal challenges that Europe faces, such as climate change, sustainable energy, healthy food. But it, of course, also is another side to it, and you discussed us with a reference to art, which is much more serendipity, which can also lead to very positive results. And I think if you build a strong international university or a strong innovation network, or we call it ecosystem, then you can make both things happen, those which are planned and will deliver you progress, but also many beautiful things which will happen actually unplanned. And I think this is something that came out very clearly in your discussion. The second point I would like to highlight is that, of course, it's a fascinating intersection between art and technology. I think the work here is very central to that. And we have also recognized that this intersection can bring a lot of solutions, not just in the field of creativity, art and culture itself, but also beyond that to other societal challenges. So at the EIT, we have now a number of programs which exactly try to operationalize these opportunities. One of them is to create an innovation community on culture, creativity. Another one is a program that helps higher education institutions to become more creative. And a third one is actually for regions such as the ones Hungary is in, those with a bit lower innovation capacity compared to other parts of Europe, to change that. So all these programs, I think, are very, very relevant also in the context of your discussion. So I would be more interested, as a final question, to see how you actually would measure the second part, the part that isn't so easy to define, meaning the things that could come out by chance, be it innovation or creativity, that is a side product from what you try to do with more hard indicators, more hard KPIs, such as how many of your students will go on to become fantastic entrepreneurs or success stories. So that would be my question. Sorry for being a bit long in my
Let me take a
comment.
first stab of it, if I may. And it's fabulous that Budapest has that resource, that what you described. But I would love to vehemently reject the idea that art and science have a different creative process, and there is more randomness or more plasticity in one or the other. I happen to be a person who works in both spaces, that we put up art exhibits as well as do science, and I think the creative process is exactly the same. And it's the same search for finding the new shapes, the new forms, the new ideas that are different from what happened before, and how do you integrate within the community that. And I don't think that the backbones that are needed to kind of create a university, a science university or an art space would be any fundamentally different. What you have to do, and that's going to be the challenge for the leadership of this university, is to create a framework in which this serendipity flourishes, right? And I think that that is really a leadership issue and a structural issue. How can we actually achieve that? But I don't think, of course, familiarity with the space is very, very important. So in that sense, having a MoMA, you probably need different type of people to run than what you would run MIT or Harvard Medical School, right? Because you have to have a certain empathy for the professional past of the institution and so on. But beyond that, it is really about creating a framework for individuals to express themselves. And once they did that, what do you do with that product, right? To create the conduits to do the next step with that product. And often my experience has been in what lacks in Eastern Europe is the next step. We have fabulous educational institutions, we have fabulous minds, we have fabulous researchers, and we lack the infrastructure to take it to the next level, to turn into great companies, great products, and so on. So the question, I guess, the challenge will be not only a MoMA challenge, it's also a national challenge, is that how you create this chain of events that the creative process that will emerge from MoMA will not stop here, but will actually influence all of us.
And that, by the way, is a unifying feature, again, of science and art, which is that you can have all the great ideas you want if you're not embedded in an ecology that will scale those ideas and give you the tools, then you end up with the perennial Hungarian problem, which is a whole lot of incredibly creative people in the Carpathian Basin, but very often, sadly, they realize their achievements outside of the country. So I think it's extraordinarily important to nurture the creativity, and Martin, you're doing this work as well, is to create the systems that do not lead to a choice down the road to that next generation of Hungarian creative about should I stay or should I go? That there should be 9 unicorns coming out of Hungary, and there should be, internationally recognized artists at the best galleries in the world coming out of Hungary. There should be fantastic design innovations coming out of Hungary, but that have the ability to get that kind of escape velocity without the actual individuals having to relocate to other countries to achieve those goals. So it's context, really, and I agree that in this respect, it's no different in science or art or business for that matter.
I think we are discussing the different layers of how to cracking up isolation. András spoken about the geographical part of it or cultural part of it. There is also a professional part. One of Lott's leading colleagues told us during the research that you want the best art and design school, you need engineers hanging around because we need more diversity on campus, physically. So we need, to the Innovation Center, we need engineers, we need scientists, we need the artists, we need the designers. That's what the Finnish did when they founded Aalto University, merging 3 universities to design, the economics and the engineering school. And it was an initial success because of its very revolutionary nature. We need to do this maybe in a smaller scale, but at MoMA as well. So I think we have to crack up the isolation of all school verticals and think more holistically about issues as Moholy Nagy himself did before.
Our time is tight, but we have a little more time for questions.
Thank you for the interesting conversation. I have a question in relation to the topic of making an international university. One of the things that often comes into play or what we use for evaluating if this university is successful and international are university rankings. One of the situations with this or issues is that in most of them, huge part is played not by the student experience, but by the research excellence of the university, by publications and academic other parts. So my question would be, what do you think should be how should the research activity of the university serve the education part And did you see any good examples of this in your research of universities across Europe?
So many questions in one question, right? The issue of
Sorry.
ranking, right? And you are right, absolutely, that some of the best known university rankings are entirely based on research output because they have no access to the student experience, to class size and things like that. The US-based university ranking system is a little bit more sophisticated. It does look actually teacher to student ratios and many other aspects.
In which MoMA is very good.
In which, that's right. So in that sense, you know, there are good references. But that's why I think that the real issue that we would need to address here is not where MoMA is ranked in the international ranking, but how does it actually rank compared to the peer institutions? And what can we learn and what can we retain from that? And kind of coming back to that discussion that we had earlier, the goal is not to match every single metrics. And I've seen that, for example, in the example of the Northeastern as well, where I'm part of. Northeastern didn't try to be a university. They tried to pick one or two areas. To my luck, they picked network sciences being one of their driving sources, right? And they said, we're going to be very good at that. And we are very good at that. We have the Network Science Institute, which is far the leading institution in that space. So I think part of the mission of MoMA will also be is to identify these one or two areas where they have the people, the talent, and the circumstances to kind of allow them to really grow and be the driver of the university. Of course, at the same time, not forgetting all the other aspects that makes a student experience great.
Questions?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation of the research outcomes. I'm Daniel Barca, Vice Rector of the university, and I had the chance to take part in the research and collaborate with Gergely, László, and András, and it was amazing to see how different approaches of research, scientific approach, and cultural approach, artistic approach, sometimes collided, and sometimes work together very well. And I think the outcome is very, very interesting, very exciting. For me, one of the key message is the network embeddedness and how we see ourselves from a network perspective from outside. And I think network science is a highly efficient tool to have a snapshot of where we are, who we are, from an outsider's perspective. My question is rather about the future. So what does network science and network embeddedness tell us about the future? We see that there are major changes coming in terms of environmental challenges, technological challenges, and we see large networks, large systems collapsing globally from day to day. And also we see isolated systems collapsing. So there is a strong vulnerability of networks. And my question is, and getting back to Gergely's remark that local networks are very important for successful university. In terms of making a resilient university for the future, is it the global network, is it the local network, high network embeddedness or low network embeddedness, which help us make a resilient future?
So, of course, you know, it's very hard to fast forward from here, you know, without further data, but let me just tell you a story about the past that reflects on that. And this is, New York City used to be the center of the garment industry. Well, once it was where actually much of the clothing that United States wore actually were manufactured. If you go there, there's still kind of a giant statue of a needle kind of in one of the corners of Manhattan, which is kind of a quarter of the garment neighborhood. What is interesting about the garment industry is that scientists, my colleagues, network scientist Brian Uzi from Northwestern, has been able to get all the paperwork about the companies that function there and see how it changed eventually to kind of transform itself out of New York City. And it was a brutal process. Many, many companies over many decades have gone bankrupt. But what was interesting is that the one that survived the most, who became the today's leaders, who are international one, were the one who were the most embedded, had the most connections to the local neighborhood. The first to go out, those who depended on one or two suppliers only, who once disappeared, they were out, right, or one or two buyers. And the most embedded institutions were the ones to survive the longest and eventually transform themselves. So this is why embeddedness is so key for resilience of the system, right? Because if you rely on one leg, if that leg out of your fault is gone, right, that's the end of the story. Now, the challenge for the leadership over here is to define that embeddedness. And I think we have discussed about that, of kind of having very deep roots to the local community, local being defined Hungary, Eastern Europe, but also developing strategic links internationally so that we have this heterogeneity of connections that can help you weather multiple impulses that will certainly come towards this place with time.
Thank you. One last.
So you mentioned that the creative process in itself is very similar to the science and art and design, but whenever it comes to the limitations of the data and the differences between these two fields, what would you say where data science can make the biggest impact in art and design as a whole, or just more local terms in case of MoMA? So
So let me give one perspective. The reason I actually spend quite a bit of my time and my lab's time of applying data to art space and design is because this is where the biggest opportunity is, right? If you want to try to apply data to the automotive industry, you're about 30 years late, right? If you want to apply to the internet, it's been there from the beginning. I personally think that the great opportunity right now, which is going to be transformational, is to figure out what data to collect and how to really apply it to the cultural sector. That is the reason why I actually spend quite a bit of my time in that space. I see an opportunity and an ability to really make a difference by defining the language, defining the tools.
And it's such a good news because one of the first international collaborations MoMA started to craft after we set up the grant office early this year, is a European collaboration seeking the perfect methodology to measure creativity. So we are in this certain business. This is very good news that you see it as a potent scientific field.
And I would like to just add, as a kind of last comment, not so much as data science observation, because one would be a fool to talk about network science next to Laszlo, but maybe just a metaphor. I mean, the way I see this connection is that what network science or data science gives you is a map of the terrain, but in the end, it's still up to you to navigate that map. It provides less answers to that. So for example, if you live in a city and you don't have a map of all the restaurants, you're going to stay hungry because you don't know where to go. But if you do have them, you still have to decide whether you want Chinese food or Hungarian food or vegetarian food. So I think that the great thing about having the data science tools is that you have a roadmap to navigate the future or certainly the present, but then you still have to make the decisions based on your values, your history, your aims that you've defined for yourself about where you're going to go on that map.
Thank you so much for the final comment. Thank you so much for the questions. I know this has been a very complex hour we spent together, and it's a very complex issue we spoke about, but I find it really funny, and I think we will just rename Q&A into Q&A because your questions were so condensed. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for being here and sharing these great results, and good work ahead.
Thank you, Nora.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.